Bueno, pois, bo día a todas e a todos. Vamos a comenzar esta segunda parte da presentación do doutoramento con un seminario. A persoa que temos hoxe de convidada para presentar este seminario é Ana Rodríguez González. Ana é agora mesmo unha postdoc na Universidade de Lund, en Suecia, e no ano 2020 defendeu a súa tese doutoral na Universidade de Pompeu Fabra, sendo dirixida pola profesora Libertad González. A pesar da súa xuventude, Ana ten un currículum excepcional, extraordinario. Xa conta con 4 publicacións excelentes na Journal of Health Economics, en Fiscal Studies, Journal of Human Resources. Pero tamén foi capaz de publicar xa en revistas de altísimo prestixio interdisciplinar, como Presidents of the National Academy of Science. Para nós é unha honra poder contar con Ana hoxe. Moitas grazas por ter vido onte. Debes estar ata un pouco cansada porque chegaches non especialmente cedo. Así que moitas grazas por a túa xenerosidade, polo teu tempo. Ana, é un goce terte en ECOBAS hoxe aquí para que nos contes un pouco a túa investigación. En inglés, very shortly, I will tell you that we have the honor to have Ana Rodríguez González with us today. She's from Galicia, although she's not living in Galicia. She got her PhD at University Pompeu Fabra in 2020 under the supervision of Libertad González. Currently, she's a postdoc at Lund University in Sweden. We are honored to have her because we believe she's a reference of an excellent PhD student and extraordinary postdoc. Already, she counts with 4 brilliant publications, 3 of them on the top journals of economics and 1 in an interdisciplinary journal. She published in topics related to health economics and human resources. And we are very glad to have her here. Thank you so much, Anna, for being with us today. The floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you again, Maria, for such a nice introduction. And thank you to ECOBAS for the opportunity to be here to give this seminar. The paper I'm going to talk about today is on the impact of increasing female advantage in education on family formation. And as I said, I'm happy to take questions, comments, or receive any feedback, both during the presentation, although I recognize it may be a bit difficult technically, but also at the end. So, yeah. I'm not sure that what you see on the screen is as likely as I see it here on the computer, so if there's anything that's not very clear, please let me know. So the motivation for this paper comes from the fact that in recent decades, many countries have seen a reversal of the traditional gender gap in educational attainment, which used to be in favor of men, but it's not the case any longer. What I'm showing you in this picture is the evolution of the gender ratio of average years of schooling of men to women in the age group 25 to 34, so relatively young population, in 3 different countries. The United States in green, Spain in this orange line, and Finland in blue. And Finland is here just because it's the country on which I'm going to focus on in this paper. So what we can see is that back in the 1970s, this gender ratio of average years of schooling of men to women was above 1, meaning that on average, men had more years of education than women had. And this was true in both 3 countries. Now, this difference gradually declined during the next decades, up to the point where we see that this ratio goes below 1, meaning that it is now women who are on average more educated. This reversal took place around the 90s in both Spain and the United States, and around 15 years earlier, so in 1980 in Finland. Now, there are reasons to believe that this reversal of the gender gap in education and increase in female advantage can have important consequences for the family. This is because, at least in heterosexual couples, traditional mating patterns have been characterized by husbands being at least as educated as their wives, and this pattern is likely to be challenged as it is women now who are more educated. We also have reasons from the economic literature to believe that changes in the gender gap in education in the marriage market, by marriage market I mean kind of the pool of potential mates, could be important. These changes can be important because marriage and family outcomes have been shown to depend on the availability of suitable partners. So what can we expect in this particular case with these changes we're talking about? On the one hand, the changes in the gender gap in education might be related to the gains from specialization between spouses and therefore affect the gains from marriage. So in this case, if we have a sufficiently large increase in the female advantage in education, the gains from specialization could potentially increase if we abstract from kind of social norms, and we could see an increase in marriage. Now, if what happens is that people just prefer a partner that has the same level of education as themselves, and we now have a change that makes the distributions of education and attainment of men and women more different to each other, this will be harder, right? It will be harder to find someone with the same level of education as you, and in particular, we might expect to see excess numbers of high educated women and low educated men who are unable to find a suitable match. Okay, so in this sense, if by increasing the female advantage in education, we see an increase in mismatch between the distributions of education and attainment of men and women, we might expect marriage rates to decline. And by the way, during the rest of the presentation, I may talk about educational mismatch, but what I have in mind when I say that is precisely this increasing dissimilarity between these two distributions. Okay. So let me go back. So in this second sense, we might expect this increase in female advantage in education to lower marriage rates. And this effect could even be stronger if there is some role for some sort of gender identity norms that make a situation where the wife is more educated than her husband, particularly undesirable. And this would be in line with some of the previous literature that I'm going to come back to in a couple of slides. Moreover, another thing that was very interesting to me and sort of a motivation to start this project, because I work a lot on health issues, is that there could also be potential health consequences of these new phenomena and these changes. And this is because the declines in men's perceived value in both labor and marriage markets have been linked with worse health outcomes for men, and in particular with increases in premature mortality, especially those coming from what has been coined in the literature as deaths of despair, which is a term to refer to deaths coming from suicides, alcohol abuse, and drug abuse. Okay, so there's kind of the seminal work by Ann Case and Angus Deaton documenting these phenomena in the United States. So now that I've given you kind of what was the motivation to start this project, let me just give you an overview of what I do in this paper and what I find. So the question I'm trying to answer here is, how do relative increases in women's level of education in the marriage market affect marriage and family outcomes? And in order to try to answer this question and move beyond correlations and try to find some causal evidence, I'm going to be exploiting the rolling out of a school reform that took place in Finland in the 1970s, which has been found to increase the female advantage in education. I'll give you, of course, many more details about both this reform and how I use it in my empirical strategy. But basically, the idea is that in order to have some plausibly exogenous variation in the gender gap in education in a marriage market, I'm going to exploit the exposure of this reform, of the marriage market to this reform. And in particular, I'm going to do a reduced form analysis in which I study what is the impact on, for instance, your probability of marriage, of having your marriage market more exposed to this reform, and as a result of that, a larger female advantage in education in your marriage market. Okay? And the variation to kind of get to this quasi-exogenous variation is going to come from the fact that this reform was not implemented in the whole Finland at the same time, but it followed a staggered implementation plan. As I said, I'll come back to this in just a couple of slides. Now, because I do a reduced form analysis, I go from this marriage market exposure to the reform to family outcomes and health outcomes later on. I also do several exercises in the paper to provide evidence suggesting that what's in the middle, kind of the mechanisms for these effects, is from these changes in the gender gap in education in the marriage market. Okay, so it may not be the only thing changing in more exposed marriage markets, but the evidence I find suggests that this is at least an important driver of these effects. Now, let me tell you just very briefly about the data. I'll also come back to this later on. I implement this with data from administrative registers from Finland. So this is high quality data that covers basically the whole population, and where each individual has a unique identifier, which is of course anonymized, but that can be used to link information for this individual across different registers. So labor market outcomes, education, civil status changes, health outcomes, and so on. Okay, and this, in particular, this comes from the Folk Fleet data modules from Statistics Finland. Let me now just give you a short overview of the results. In the paper, I first kind of corroborate the previous findings that the reform led to an increase in the female advantage in education. And in particular, I find that the reform led to a 19% increase in the female advantage in continuing education after secondary school, so after high school, and to a reversal of the gender gap in university education. Okay, so before the reform, women were already more likely to have some post-secondary education, but this advantage widened with the reform, and there was a small advantage for men in going to university, and this was reversed with the reform. And as I said, these findings are consistent with previous evidence by Thomas Pekarinen, who had shown the gender differential impacts of this reform. Then, in where is the core part of my paper, I find that in marriage markets that were more exposed to the reform and that as a result had a larger female advantage in education, there were declines in marriage and fertility. And in particular, I find that there's a decrease in the share of men who are in a couple, either married or cohabiting in their 40s, and a decrease in the number of children that they have. And the size of these effects is relatively sizable compared to the changes in family structure that took place in Finland during this period. Then I provide suggestive evidence that is consistent with the changes in the gender gap in education in these marriage markets being an important driver. And as such, I find that the negative effects are stronger for both high educated women and low educated men, which is then consistent with this idea that in more exposed marriage market, there was this larger mismatch between the distributions of educational attainment of men and women. And along these lines, I also find that these effects are stronger in marriage markets where this mismatch, so to speak, increased more. And finally, the last results I want to talk about here are the effects on health outcomes. And sadly, I also find that in marriage markets with a larger female advantage in education, there is an increase in mental health and alcohol-related problems for men, especially those with low levels of education. And this is measured by hospital visits. So before going into details about the empirical strategy, the results, and so, let me just give you an idea of how I think this paper fits into the literature and how it tries to contribute. The paper is first related to a literature and the implications of the reversal of the gender gap in education, a literature that has been so far, to the best of my knowledge, mostly descriptive. So we have, for instance, studies by Esteve and co-authors showing that as the female advantage in education increases in the population, so does the prevalence of couples where the wife is more educated than her husband. So this paper tries to contribute to this literature by providing some causal estimates of the effect of this reform that increased the female advantage in education. The second literature to which this paper speaks to is the causal literature on the direct effect of women's education on their marriage and fertility outcomes. So the direct effect of having more education for the probability of marriage, fertility, and so on. This is a relatively large literature, and the conclusion from it seems to be that in developed countries, at least, more female education decreases teenage births, but when it comes to completed fertility, the effects are relatively small or even positive, depending a bit on the country. And more education has also been shown to have little effect on the probability of marriage per se. So I think the results from my paper kind of complement this literature by highlighting the importance of the relative levels of education of men and women in the marriage market for family outcomes beyond the impact of one's level of education. And in doing so, I think it also creates a nice bridge with the literature that has looked at the impact on the family of sex ratio changes in marriage markets. And especially to a few papers in this literature that have looked at educational level specific sex ratio changes. And finally, I think this paper also speaks to a recent literature that has studied the consequences for the family of changes in the relative position of men and women that kind of go against traditional gender norms. And we have work here in this literature, for instance, looking at the impact of relative income for marriage and fertility. Most notably, I would say the paper by Bertrand, Kameni, Campan, where they show that when in a given marriage market, women become more likely to earn more than men, this leads to a decrease in marriage rates. Another part of this literature has looked at intimate partner violence as an outcome and found that relative advances in women's economic position, either in terms of employment or relative income, can also lead to an increase in intimate partner violence. And finally, there's another part of this literature that has studied the tension between women's career success and relationship outcomes. For instance, the paper by Ulle Folke and Johanna Rickne, where they show that women's promotions to top positions, but not men's, increase the probability of divorce. And they do that analyzing just winning versus just losing parliamentarian, so politicians in Sweden, and also studying promotions to CEO positions. So in this paper, I contribute to this literature by studying the implications of the relative changes in the position of men and women in terms of educational attainment, which is a dimension that is of course related to these other measures of the labor markets, such as employment or earnings, but is slightly different and is both, first, it hasn't been studied so far to the best of my knowledge, and it's highly relevant in the context of many countries around the world that are seeing this reversal of the gender gap in education and this increase in female advantage in education, as I was mentioning just in the first slide. Okay, so this is it for the introduction. Let me just pause for 1 second to see if there's kind of any clarifying question at this point. Otherwise, I'll start by telling you the details about the empirical strategy. As I said, I'm going to be exploiting the implementation of this school reform that took place in Finland in the 1970s. This is known as the Finnish comprehensive school reform, and it's a reform not unlike others that took place in other Nordic countries, also during the 20th century. Unlike the reforms that took place, for instance, in Sweden or in Norway, the Finnish comprehensive school reform did not affect in practice the years of compulsory schooling, and at least that's what the Finnish papers tell us about. But what it did, it delayed the choice of academic versus vocational track from age 11 to age 16. So before the reform, there was what is known as a selective school system, whereas at age 11, children already had to decide whether to continue with a more kind of academic-oriented education that would allow them to eventually go to university, or whether they stay with a more practically oriented education that would enable them to get some vocational training later on, but not to go to university. After the reform, these former selective schools were eliminated and the new comprehensive schools were created. And in these comprehensive schools, children were kept together from age 7 to age 16. And it was only at age 16 that then they had to decide whether to go on with the academic or with the vocational track. Okay, so there's this delay in this important choice. There's this previous paper by Thomas Pekarinen showing that the reform led to an increase in the female advantage in choosing the academic track and then in going to university. And the reason why the reform had this gender differential effect is not something I would say we have hard evidence on. The reason that Pekarinen proposes is that it has to do with gender differences in the timing of puberty, by which, on average, by age 16, girls are more mature than boys, and this gender difference in maturity might exacerbate any gender differences in academic performance or aspirations, and therefore affect the educational investments that students make at this age. But I think you could also come up with alternative explanations, such as parents playing less of a role in the choice when it's at age 16 than when it was at age 11, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, I do not have the necessary data to be able to really test which of these alternative hypotheses is true, and this is kind of a bit outside the scope of this paper. What I'm interested in for the reform is just that it created this gender differential effect. And second, that it followed this interesting implementation path that gives us some nice variation. So the reform was implemented in different municipalities in different years, from 1972 to 1977. And when a municipality first implemented the reform, only children aged 11 or younger were enrolled in the new system, whereas the older children were never exposed. So I hope you can see this. I'm showing you the map of Finland, and, and the different colors indicate the year of implementation of the reform in different municipalities. So as you can see, in 1972, the northern municipalities started implementing the reform, and then the ones in the east and the south continued. So the order of implementation followed kind of this geographical order. So it was definitely not random. The order of implementation of the reform for a given municipality. So of course, controlling for unobservable characteristics of the municipalities is gonna be very important, and I'll come back to the specific assumptions that we need to make in a couple of minutes. But the idea is that because of this staggered implementation, and because when a municipality reform, only the younger children were exposed to the new system, we have this nice variation within municipalities across cohorts in exposure to the new school system, and within cohorts across municipalities. And by cohort, by the way, I'm meaning here just the year of birth. Okay. So this is the sort of interesting variation that this reform gives us. So what I actually do in the paper has maybe I could say two parts. In the first part, I corroborate these previous findings that the reform increased the female advantage in education. And in the second part, which is the core of my paper, I study the effect of marriage market exposure to the reform on family outcomes. So the first part, because it's mostly about kind of corroborating these previous findings, is a bit less exciting, and I'm going to give you just an overview of what I do and what I find, and to have more time to focus on the second part, but I'm very happy to come back to it if there are any questions later on. But the idea of the first part is just to exploit this variation by municipality and cohort with a sort of differences in differences strategy with variation in treatment timing. So the sort of regressions I'll be running would be something like this, where I'll be regressing an individual's educational attainment level on this dummy variable equal to 1 for cohorts affected by the reform in a given municipality, while controlling for cohort fixed effects, municipality fixed effects, and region-specific linear trends. So I estimate this regression for men and women separately, and I estimate the impact on the gender gap like this. So the assumption that we need to give the results from this exercise sort of a causal interpretation is that the timing of adoption of the reform in different municipalities is unrelated to trends in educational attainment. And this is something that is, of course, untestable, but I try to provide supporting evidence for the assumption by doing an event study analysis and showing that there's no evidence of differential pre-trends before the implementation of the reform. Now, this is also kind of the same specification that Pekarinen and other papers studying the impact of the reform on other outcomes have used. The literature on differences in difference has changed a lot in the last few years. So I also update this analysis with more current methods, and I find mostly robust results. So let me just give you kind of the headlines of what I find to be able to have time to devote to the second part. I find that, as Pekarinen did, the reform increased women's level of educational attainment, but not men's. So as a result, the female advantage in continuing education after secondary school increased by 19%. And there was this reversal of the gender gap in university education, which was before the reform in favor of men. Okay. So now, taking into account that the reform led to this increase in the female educational advantage, then I ask myself the question, okay, what is the impact on someone's family outcomes of having their marriage market more exposed to this reform, and as a result, a larger female advantage in education in their marriage market. And when I do this exercise, I also control for whether an individual was yourself exposed to the new school system, whether they went to the new comprehensive school or to the former selective school. And I think that that is very important because own exposure to the reform can change your level of educational attainment, which might in itself have an impact on family outcomes, but also it changes the set of peers to which you're exposed, which can also have an impact on family outcomes. So I think it is very important to control for that. And the reason why I can kind of separate these two things, this marriage market exposure to the reform from this own exposure to the reform, is because own exposure changes at the municipality year of birth level, as I was showing you in the previous regression, whereas marriage markets do not fully overlap with municipality cohort groups. Why? Because people marry outside of their municipalities, which are rather small in the context of Finland. There are like 490 municipalities. And people marry outside of their cohorts. And in particular, this is different for men and women. Men tend to marry slightly younger women, and women tend to marry slightly older men. And this is true in Finland as well as in many other countries. So this is a bit kind of the idea behind this second part. But to be more specific, these are the sort of regressions I will be running. I'm going to be regressing someone's an indicator for someone's, for instance, probability of marriage or number of children on this measure of marriage market exposure to the reform. And this variable is just going to be the proportion of people in their marriage market who were enrolled in the new school system. Okay. And what is a marriage market? In my baseline specification, I define the marriage market as consisting of individuals who were born in the same region as yourself, from the relevant cohorts, and to decide which are the relevant cohorts, I look at the marriage patterns in pre-reform cohorts, so in a slightly older cohorts who were not affected by the reform. So for instance, I go to slightly older cohorts and I ask, okay, what's the probability that a man marries a woman who were born in the same year of birth? What's the probability that he marries a woman that is 1 year younger, 2 years younger, etc. So I take these frequencies and I use them to give kind of weights to everyone else for your marriage market. Okay, so baseline definition, individuals born in the same region from relevant cohorts. This is based on pre-reform cohorts marriage patterns, and importantly, I checked that these marriage patterns are not significantly altered by exposure to the reform itself. Nonetheless, the results are also robust to alternative specifications of the marriage market. Okay, so coming back to the regression, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but I'm going to be regressing, for instance, your probability of marriage on this measure of marriage market exposure to the reform, while controlling, as I was saying, for own exposure, again, this dummy, which is equal to 1, for cohorts affected by the reform in a municipality M, while controlling, again, for cohort fixed effects, municipality fixed effects, and region-specific linear trends. So that would be the type of equations I'll be running. Now, let me give you just some more details about the data. As I said, this is administrative data from Finland. The cohorts I'm going to be looking at are those from 1948 to 1966. And this is to get the cohorts where we have more variation in exposure to the reform, which are the ones from 1961 to 1966, and also a bunch of pre-reform cohorts to better estimate pre-trends and so on. So I'm going to focus on individuals who were born in Finland. And the only region that I have to exclude are the Åland Islands, which is a Swedish-speaking small region in Finland. And this is because I do not know the year of implementation of the reform in this region. But overall, then I'm left with the other 18 regions in Finland. I'm going to study in my baseline results the outcomes at age 40 to be able to get like a nice sample size, but also to give them time to make important family formation decisions. And given that in my data I found that people kind of marry and have children at a relatively younger age, much younger than here, this covers, I think, most of these important decisions, but the results are also robust to looking at all their ages. So important variables that I'm going to need from the data are the year and municipality of birth, and I use this information to construct variables for own exposure to the reform and this marriage market exposure to the reform. So this is based on municipality and region of birth. Then as main outcomes, I'm going to be looking at variables of educational attainment, marriage and cohabitation variables. So I'm going to be looking at the probability that by age 40 you have ever been formally married, and at whether at this age you are either married or cohabiting. And then in terms of fertility, I'm going to study the number of children and also the extensive margin, so the probability that you're childless by age 40. In the paper, I also have results looking at some other outcomes, but for the sake of time, I do not think I can show you the results on this today, but I'm happy to talk about them later on. What I hope I'll have time to show you is the results on health outcomes. So I combined the data from Statistics Finland with the Finnish Hospital Discharge Register, which is managed by the Institute of Health and Welfare in Finland. And this contains information on both all contacts with the hospital system, so either outpatient or inpatient visits, meaning visits to the hospital, whether you spend the night or even if you don't, so that would be the outpatient visits. And this data contains information on the date of the visit and importantly on the diagnosis code. Okay? And I'll tell you later on which the diagnostics codes I'm going to be focusing on. Yeah. So let me show you just some descriptive statistics maybe, so you have like a clear idea of how education and marriage patterns in Finland look like for these cohorts. The first panel, I don't know if you can see it very clearly, but shows you the proportion of people with university education. The solid line is for women, the dashed line is for men. As what we can see is that for cohorts born before 1960, men were slightly more likely than women to go to university, but precisely for these cohorts, we see kind of this reversal taking place. And after that, women younger cohorts, they are more likely to have a university degree. In terms of marriage, this panel here shows you the probability of having ever been married by age 40 for people born in each of these cohorts. And this one here shows you the probability of being either married or cohabiting exactly at age 40. And we see that both of these have been declining for the cohorts during this period, and faster for men than for women when it comes to the probability of having been ever married. But we do see kind of a fast decline also in marriage or cohabitation by age 40. And finally, for the number of children, we see that there was an increase up to the cohorts born in 1960 in fertility. And after that, this kind of plateaus and decreases a little bit for younger cohorts. So let me come back and maybe if there are no questions at this point, just show you the main results. So, by the way, I'm going to show you results mostly on men's outcomes, and in this I'm following the literature in which they study kind of some changes in the marriage market, and then they focus on the results of one of the genders. The results for women are of course consistent, but I think that in this particular case, men's outcomes are more easy to interpret, given that I do not find that the reform had any impact on their level of education, and as such, we can interpret more clearly these results as coming from the changes in just their exposure through the marriage market to the reform. So the first two columns show you the results for marriage outcomes, last two columns for fertility, and what I'm showing you here is the coefficient of marriage market exposure to the reform, and this is expressed in terms of standard deviations. So the first result is that higher marriage market to the reform does not significantly decrease the probability of having been ever married by age 40, but it significantly decreases the probability of being in a couple, either married or cohabiting at this age, and by 1 percentage point. And this, if we compare it to the pre-reform mean, would be a 1.4 percentage decrease in the share of men married or cohabiting. When we look at fertility, we see a no significant increase in the probability of not having any children and a significant decrease in the number of children by 3.1 percentage points, which is 1.7% decrease in the number of children. Now, these are the effects that come from one standard deviation to the reform. If we compare these effects with the changes in family structure that took place in Finland during this period, we can say that an increase in marriage market exposure to the reform from the 25th to the 75th percentile of the distribution can account for around 20% of the decline in the share of married men that we observed during this period. So what is going on here? So I think kind of the first explanation that can come to your mind is that, okay, these men have their marriage market more exposed to the reform. So there's more educated women in the marriage market, and these women that have a higher level of education are delaying fertility or being less prone to marry. However, when I study the effects of the reform on women, kind of the effect of own exposure to the reform on their family outcomes, that is the effect of kind of having more education, I find that the effects are, if anything, they're rather small, but they're, if anything, positive. And this is, by the way, in line with this previous literature I was mentioning before that finds that more education for women in continental Europe can have positive effects on completed fertility. So it doesn't seem that the effects are driven by women in this marriage market having a lower propensity to marry because of their higher level of education. Rather, I think that this increasing mismatch between men and women's level of education seems a more plausible explanation. And I provide a couple of pieces of evidence that are consistent with this. First, as I said, I look at heterogeneous effects by level of education, and I find that the effects are stronger for low-educated men and high-educated women. Let me show you just the heterogeneous results for men, in which I just split them by level of education, and I look at the same outcomes. I'm going to focus here on these two ones that on which I found significant results. So the first column would show you the results for those with low levels of education, meaning those that have at most some secondary schooling. And in the second column, for its outcome, we see those that have more than secondary schooling. As you can see, the effects are larger and only significant for those that have low levels of education. And if I do kind of the same thing for women, I also find that the results are only, that marriage market exposure to the reform only decreases marriage and fertility outcomes for women with high level of education. The thing is that to do that, I need to focus on those cohorts not directly affected by the reform and just play with the degree of exposure to the marriage market, because since the reform increased women's level of education, we cannot just condition on the level of education to split the sample into groups, as we did for men, because then we would be conditioning on a post-treatment variable and just bringing a lot of bias into our results. Just a small technical note. But in any way, the fact that these negative effects are stronger for low-educated women and high-educated men is consistent with this just toy figure of the distributions I was showing you at the beginning. Second, I find that these negative effects are stronger in marriage markets where this mismatch between the distributions increased more. And to look at this, I exploit heterogeneity in the baseline gap in the gender gap in education. So even before the reform, there were some regions in Finland where men had a substantial advantage in university education, whereas in others, women had already caught up to a great extent. Because of this, the reform had in some regions the effect of, in the regions where men had a larger advantage, with the reform, this gap closed, whereas in regions where more men and women were already kind of equal, we see that the gap in education, the gender gap in education that emerges with the reform is in absolute terms larger than what was there before. Okay, so because of this difference, we can see that in some marriage markets, the reform increased the gender difference in education in absolute terms, whereas in others, this gender gap did not increase or it even decreased. Okay, so I classify marriage markets in these two groups. And when I do, I find that the effects are stronger in the marriage markets where this mismatch increased more. Now, I want to have time to show you the results on health because I think they're also quite interesting. So let me just come back to the data I was explaining before. As I said, I combined the administrative register with this hospital outpatient and inpatient data. And I follow this previous literature that had documented these potential detrimental effects for men of this decline in their perceived value in labor and marriage markets. As I said, this literature focused on kind of premature mortality from deaths of despair, suicides, alcohol, drug-related deaths. In this case, I am able to look at a less extreme outcome than mortality, so I'm going to be looking at hospital visits. But I follow the same idea when I select the diagnosis. So I'm going to be looking at mental health problems, alcoholic liver disease and cirrhosis, and drug overdose. And in particular, my outcome variables are going to be the probability of maintaining hospital visits, either outpatient or inpatient, at ages 40 to 45 with some of these diagnoses. And this is what I find. Again, what I'm showing you in this table is the coefficient of marriage market exposure to the reform, again expressed in the standard deviations, in separate regressions where the outcome variable is the one indicated in its row. Okay, so for instance here, this first number shows you that in marriage markets more exposed to the reform, and as such with a larger female advantage in education, men in general had a somewhat larger probability of having a hospital visit with a mental health diagnosis, and also somewhat higher probability of having a hospital visit with an alcoholic liver diagnosis. And there's absolutely no effect on substance abuse diagnoses, which are also quite more rare. Now, if we split men now by level of education, we would expect to see stronger effects on those with low levels of education, given that it was also for those that we saw stronger effects on marriage and family outcomes. And this is exactly what I find. Here again, I'm splitting the same way men by low and high level of education. And we see that these increases in mental health and alcoholic liver disease hospital visits are only there for those with low levels of education. Size of these effects would be, for women in general, a 9% increase in the probability of a mental health diagnosis, 12% for the low educated, 12% increase in the probability of alcoholic liver problems, 16% for the low educated. And finally, just a note that if I look at the effects of own exposure to the reform on these health outcomes, I do not find any such direct effects, which is consistent also with a recent working paper that is looking at the direct effects of this change in tracking on health outcomes, and does not find that there were any direct effects. Okay, so then I ran a bunch of robustness checks, playing with alternative definitions of the marriage markets and alternative specifications. So for instance, I include municipality-specific trends rather than region-specific trends. I drop the trends and then just take out the region pre-trends. I exclude kind of the Helsinki region. I define exposure to the reform based not on the place of birth, but the place where students were living in the year of implementation of the reform, or in 1970, so just after the implementation. And I also use randomization inference to check the robustness of the results to a different level of clustering the standard errors, and to have some kind of placebo exercise. But yeah, I'm happy to go into detail about any of these if there are any questions, but let me just kind of conclude. So in this paper, what I try is to study the consequences of the increasing female educational advantage on the marriage market, and to do so, I exploit the changes that come from this school reform. My main finding is that in marriage markets with a larger female advantage in education, there were declines in marriage and fertility. In particular, for men, I find that they are less likely to be in a couple in their 40s, and they have fewer children. These findings are consistent with previous evidence that relative advances in women's economic positions can sort of generate some frictions in the marriage markets. And my results also, although like a general welfare assessment is outside the scope of this paper, these results also point at potential negative health consequences for men's health in terms of mental health and alcohol and health behaviors, for instance, alcohol abuse. And these are there in particular for men with low levels of education. And this is it for me.
Thank you so much, Anna, for this great seminar. And yeah, take a minute, drink your water, and before we get ready here for questions. I have some on my own, but I'm sure the audience has also some questions. So probably the way of proceeding is that anyone who has a question should raise the hand and go back forward for the microphone, or I repeat the question here, as you like. So Emma, feel free. Yeah, you may have to move, or else if you like, I can repeat it, Emma.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a very nice presentation. I have a question. Do you control somehow for the household where the woman belongs to? Because I would expect that households that they have a very high income, even after or before the reform, the woman will go to the university anyway. So, so I would expect that lower incomes also, so the extreme ones, right? That the reform would affect less, because if they come from households that they have a low income, even after the reform, the woman perhaps cannot go on increasing education, right?
So you mean the kind of the household, like their parents' income?
Yes, yes.
I do not do that in this paper, but because I just recently got the census data that I need to link them to their parents. But in the paper by Pekarinen, he does look not as in particular by income, but by their parents' education, and he finds that this differential gender effect is clear if you look at families where the parents do not have academic education. So that is in line with the effects that you suggest. I just look at kind of the average or the combined effect, but it's true that now with the new data, I could kind of explore this a little bit more. That's a good suggestion. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Other comment or question? Yeah, here too as well.
Thank you very much, Anna, for your interesting presentation. Did you find any effect in your study on the fact that the reform was implemented nearly 4 years before in the areas of North Finland, mostly of them rural areas with a very low population, regarding the urban areas in the south of Finland?
So the fact that it was implemented in different years is exactly what I'm exploiting for the kind of identification. But it's true that the northern part is, of course, a much less populated area with low levels of education, etc. So if I look at kind of how the levels of education look like across these different regions, I see that, of course, there were lower levels of education there. But if I look at trends, I do not see any evidence that there were kind of following differential trends before the reform. And that is what I need to be able to implement this strategy with this gradual implementation plan.
Thank you. Any other comments or thoughts? Yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I have a question. When you study the probability of having a hospital visit for men from 40 to 45 years old, why do you select this interval and not go faster on the top in the interval? Thank you very much.
So, can you repeat the last part? What I choose, the age range or what?
Why the main interval 40, 45 years?
Yeah. So most of my results are looking at just at age 40, but in order to have an outcome variable that was not, well, basically to have more variation, I chose like a broader age range. I could look also at 40, but then kind of the mean of the dependent variable will for sure be lower, and it would be less smooth. That was the reason.
Yeah. Thank you for the presentation. I have just two questions or comments. First is related issue that the more education have the women, the marriage market works in the following way. So previously, 50, 60 years ago, doctors get married with nurses, but as more women are educated, then doctors' colleagues are also women, and then finally they marry with women doctors. Mm-hmm. So probably my question is if with your data you can study the polarization in the income of the families because of this dynamics of the marriage market. And the second question is that, well, I was somehow, don't say confused or, well, somehow amazed with the consequences of the results of your paper, because we are very concerned with the gender equality, but what you are saying is that here we have big losers, that they are men with low education, because they became more alcoholic and have more diseases. So, well, is there any, so your work suggests that we should be concerned also as a gender policy to think about these low-educated men?
Thank you for the questions. So the first one was, if I got it correct, about basically how the changes in assortative mating can affect the inequality in earnings. So I do not focus so much on this paper. I do look at the probability of kind of the relative level of education within spouses, but the reason I do not focus so much is because I can only offer some suggestive evidence, in the sense that the level of education of your partner is conditional on you having a partner. So it's in this kind of reduced form framework, it's a bit difficult to get at that causally. But the evidence that I find is that there's also an increase in the probability that women that men marry a woman that is more educated than them, and there's also a slight increase in the probability that the two have the same level of education. And I think this connects nicely with a lot of recent literature that has specifically looked at this issue in a more structural way, to be able to account for kind of also some general equilibrium effects. And that has related, how this increase in female advantage in education translates into the gender, like the differences in education or in earnings within spouses, and how can this contribute to the evolution of inequality. And I think that there's a bit of conflicting evidence in the results of that literature, but that's a bit outside the scope of what I do here, but it's of course a very interesting potential explanation. I just think that with this reduced form and partial equilibrium framework, it's a bit hard to these effects in a very clean way. And regarding the second question about should we be worried about these men, I think also connected to my first response is that what I'm estimating is something in partial equilibrium. So it is possible that while these effects are there, in a more medium long run, as the fact that women are more educated than men becomes more common, the social norms around it change, and these effects could even dissipate. But in any case, I think the broader literature that I was mentioning before, so for instance, these papers by Case and Deaton, and also more sociological accounts from Coyle and Dugan, or the papers by Autor and co-authors, point a bit in this direction. And I do not think, so they have looked a lot about at the kind of economic consequences. For instance, the paper by Autor looks at the impact of more import pressure in the US and how the men working kind of in the manufacturing sector are displaced. And they also find that this leads them to both be less likely to marry, but also to be more idle and to have more premature mortality. So I think there is a general concern in this literature about what has been called sometimes as the men left behind. And I think culture, something that sometimes it's a bit hard to grasp with the kind of with the econometric or the tools that we have, also plays a big role, and these effects are very contingent on a set of social norms that kind of prescribes an appropriate role for men and women, which could also be, and changing those could be a good way of kind of attenuating any potential negative effects. Although, of course, it's very complicated.
Any other question or comment? Then if you may allow me, I have just 2 quick questions. I thought it was very interesting. I congratulate you. When you show us that women are less likely to remain married at the age of 40, when you show, is it because they simply didn't get married, or else because they got divorced and they are already divorced by the age of 40?
So I looked at divorce as an outcome. Divorce has the same problems as, for instance, the relative level of education. It's kind of you need to kind of condition on having married at all to look at that. And I do not find any significant decrease in the probability of divorce. So I think this decrease in the probability of being in a couple comes from either couples that would have not getting formally married in the first place, or from separations, which I cannot measure that well in the data.
Yeah, which is quite common in the Nordic countries, right? To get together and to separate without having records for that, legal records. And the second question I have is about a bit following my colleague in terms of social norms. You have a great data, spatial data, so I wonder if you could control, not for social norms because it's very difficult, but for cultural differences or perceptions between rural, non-rural and all that, in terms of some sort of peer effects. You do a little bit what the colleagues around are doing, you know what I mean? Even though you may not have specific records, but nevertheless, there are some customs embedded, and you may, I don't know to what extent, no idea to what extent you could control for that.
No, that's, I think, a great suggestion. I could look, if anything else, a bit at heterogeneity. Yeah, I mean, the only concern would be that if I look at, so there's kind of this separation, that the north is much more rural, etc., then the variation in kind of exposure to the reform becomes smaller. So I guess that it would have less power, but I think that even if it's just to get some suggestive evidence, that would be very interesting.
That's great. So any other comments or questions from the people from the audience that, I don't know if we got any comments, but if anyone wants to write a question, please do so, and we will try to address it here. Se hai alguén da audiencia que queira facer unha pregunta que non este aquí presente, pois que o escriban na medida do posible ou que traten de interaccionar, pero non hai nada, non? Ok. Sí. Tamén poden utilizar os nosos correos electrónicos ou o correo de ECOBAS para facer as preguntas oportunas e trataremos de contestalas aquí, mentras que este xurde. Non sei se os nosos alumnos de doutorado teñen algunha cuestión ou algunha curiosidade extra adicional, non? Con respecto ao que é a túa trayectoria, Ana, e o que é o teu bo facer, o teu bo saber. Non sei se algún dos presentes quere che facer algunha pregunta fora do que é o teu artigo académico e o traballo académico que nos presentaches. Anyone who is here starting a PhD program, and does anyone have a question for Ana in terms not only of the paper she already presented, but in general terms on what was the most difficult part of her PhD, or how to face a job market, or how to think about publications, and how she started creating or thinking creating the path to publish her work. Does anyone have any of these questions? Because I think they may be rather relevant. Because, Ana, se non te importa, poderías ilustrarnos de como empezaches a crear o teu primeiro paper, o que creo que saliu publicado en Journal of Health Economics, de cesáreas.
Sí, pois...
Non sei se facémolo en inglés ou... Bueno, como consideres, sí.
Pois ese paper saiu un pouco de coñecer a literatura sobre variacións na práctica médica e variacións en utilización de...
Utilización excesiva, entre comillas.
Sí, a utilización dos servicios sanitarios entre diferentes rexións, pero tamén entre diferentes hospitais, incluso dentro do mesmo hospitais, entre diferentes médicos. E, claro, as cesáreas era un tema no que hai bastante variación, hai moita variación entre países, hai moita variación dentro de España, hai variación entre hospitais. E, por outro lado, hai toda esta literatura médica, entón, si xurdiu así dunha forma un pouco de interdisciplinar. Hai toda esta literatura médica que relacionaba as cesáreas uns peores resultados de saúde tanto para as nais como para os bebés, pero realmente non había nada de que nos recoñecésemos como unha boa evidencia causal, no sentido de que non hai ensaios clínicos onde se asigna aleatoriamente as nais a ter un tipo de parto ou outro, xa vai ben, pero claro, estaba todo basado nas correlacións, comparando só o estado de saúde de nenos nacidos por cesárea con nenos nacidos por parto normal. E claro, estes dous grupos poden ser moi diferentes en moitos aspectos, non? A cesárea normalmente faise porque hai algún problema tanto durante o embarazo, durante o parto, que fai que a cesárea sexa necesaria. Entón, se ti despois ves que os nenos nacidos por cesárea teñen peor saúde, é moi difícil concluir que isto ven da cesárea en sí, e non destas outras diferencias que xa existían. Entón, vimos como oportunidade de contribuir utilizando ferramentas de economía, de econometría, poder intentar aportar un pouco de evidencia causal sobre o efecto das cesáreas na saúde, partindo un pouco da base de que esperábamos que houvese variación entre hospitais ou dentro dun hospital entre diferentes médicos, etc. Saí un pouco dali. Ademais, tamén está como moi relacionado con un tema no que se investiga moito en economía, unha investigación que está crecendo moito, que é a de cal é o efecto das condicións a unha tempranidade, é dicir, tanto cando os bebés están no útero como durante os primeiros días de vida, todo o que pasa neste período agora se sabe que é como moi importante para os nosos resultados a largo plazo, tanto nivel educativo como resultados no mercado laboral, salarios, etc. Entón, hai un interés crecente en entender o efecto de esas condicións a unha idade temprana. Se sabe moito eso sobre que pasa cando está no útero ou cando nos primeiros anos de vida, e, sin embargo, había menos evidencia sobre o efecto de toda unha serie de intervencións médicas que teñen lugar no propio proceso de parto en sí de forma bastante rutinaria. Entón, conectamos un pouco estas diferentes preguntas que tiñamos.
Pois certamente resultou unha liña de investigación moi atractiva, moi interesante, non? Da que produciche polo menos 2 artículos extraordinarios.
Sí, empezamos traballando cos datos de varios hospitais españois e despois tivemos a sorte de coñecer a un investigador de Finlandia que tiña estes datos bastante maravillosos, que tiña unha idea bastante semellante, comezamos a traballar xuntos e gracias a eso pudemos acceder a estes datos que foron os que despois utilicei para facer este artigo tamén que presentei hoxe. Foi un pouco a través desta colaboración.
Pois estupenda colaboración, moi fructífera, desde logo que sí. Non sei se, mentras tanto, Carmen, nos chegou algunha pregunta, algunha cuestión, nada máis. Si, temos outra de audiencia, outra persona que... Pedro, que creo que eres Pedro, non?
Vale. É difícil saber que...
Sí, estamos todos un pouco en incógnito, non? Así, pero pola voz, Pedro. Eu repito, para que a xente na casa escoite. O que lle están a preguntar a Gana para a xente que non nos escoita aquí é dentro a pregunta que lle fan está relacionada co feito de que podes a diferencia ou a discrepancia que existe cara ao futuro na literatura económica, se vai a ser máis teórica ou se vai a ser máis empírica. E lle preguntan un pouco a Ana cal é a súa percepción, non? Ata agora houve unhas determinadas tendencias, se esas tendencias se van a romper, se o empirismo, entre comillas, como lle chaman algún, vai a empezar a florecer ou non, ou a ver, Ana, que opinas ti?
A ver, eu creo, a miña perspectiva tamén está un pouco influenciada por a investigación que eu fago, que ao final sempre estás un pouco nunha mesma burbulla, pero a miña impresión sí que sería esa que, en xeral, a investigación empírica parece que ten como un pouco máis de tirada agora mesmo, pero eso depende moitísimo de cada departamento. Hai departamentos que están como moito máis nominados por un grupo máis aplicado, outros son moi fortes en teoría. Entón, eu creo que se miramos, por exemplo, o Nobel deste ano, si toda esta Credibility Revolution, todas esta investigación empírica está como nun moi bon momento, pero ao final, a hora de decidir o que un se vai a dedicar como investigador, eu diría que, claro, son cosas tan diferentes que tens que facer algo que che guste, porque por moito que hai unha cousa que estea máis en boga nun momento determinado, o que vai estar co teu traballo durante todo o tempo que lle dediques a iso, vas a ser ti, se non che gusta, isto vai a ser a desventaxa máis importante, eu creo.
Tens razón, hai que seleccionar algo que realmente apasione. Algúna outra idea, pregunta, suxestión? Pois eu che quero facer unha, Ana. A ver, ti seguro que tiveches non só unha oportunidade de traballos, non o mellor varias. Eu che quería facer a pregunta de como encaraches o job market cando remataches o teu doutorado. Ti seguro que tiñas claro que querías seguir no mundo académico. O mundo académico é duro, todos os mundos son duros, o académico tamén. Entón, quería che preguntar, que pensas ti que te fixo posicionarte mellor que algúns dos rivais que ti tiñas para eses traballos, xente que tamén eran aplicantes, solicitantes dese traballo? Que pensas ti que foron as características que máis valoraron en ti?
A ver, eu creo que, bueno, primeiro, unha cousa da que me decatei facendo entrevistas e tal con diferentes sitios é que un factor fundamental é que ti sexas como un bo fit para o departamento no sentido de que, bueno, que sexas o que ti estás buscando porque hai un grupo moi desarrollado nunha determinada liña que é o que ti faz. Entón, creo que ese foi, neste caso, un condicionante importante para que a mí me ofreceran o traballo. Despois, unha cousa que xogou ao meu favor tamén fora que xa tiña algunha publicación durante o doutorado, en boas revistas e tal, entón, eso creo que sí, que pudo marcar a diferencia. Sí, non sei.
Pensas que tamén hai a cultura de big names, é dicir, pois, o feito de facer o doutorado na Pompeu, certamente...
Sí. Mentiría, o sea, non. Eso que non.
Tamén dá cosa.
Claro, eu fun ao mercado internacional, que é como moi estructurado, que ti vas a estas conferencias, bueno, este ano todo online, pero estas conferencias agora en mercado europeo, o ano no que fun eu era, por exemplo, en Rotterdam, entón ti vas alí, son 2 ou 3 días de entrevistas constantemente con todos os departamentos, e despois fun ao mercado americano, onde o mesmo na conferencia da Asociación de Economía Americana. Entón está todo coordinado para que todo o mundo estea como o mesmo momento, o cal é bastante eficiente, tamén bastante estresante. E a partir de aí, despois te invitan a dar un seminario nun determinado departamento, onde presentas o teu traballo, coñeces un pouco os que podrían ser os teus potenciais futuros colegas, e ese un pouco o proceso que se fai nese mercado e tal. Aí o importante tamén, bueno, na entrevista tes que saber venderte dunha forma un pouco condensada, non como estou facendo agora aquí, explayándome moitísimo, intentar capturar a atención dos entrevistadores nun corto período de tempo e despois o que é importante é elixir como ese artigo da túa tesi que vai ser o teu market paper, que é como a túa carta de presentación a maior parte dos departamentos e o que vas a presentar cando vas a esta visita e do que te pregunta a maior parte de xente. Te pregunta tamén sobre o resto da túa tese de doutorado, pero sobre todo falas deste job market paper.
Exactamente. É exactamente un momento moi estresante, non? Porque, claro, estás aí, ademais os períodos son os que son, e tens que ter as cousas preparadas e demais, entón sí que consume bastante enerxía. E despois, por que te fuches a Lund? Lund, concretamente.
Pois, primeiro, porque me querían contratar, un punto importante, e segundo, porque é un departamento que ten un grupo de economía aplicada moi grande, con xente moi boa que traballa en temas de saúde, de familia, de educación, tamén teñen acceso a uns datos incribles, bueno, os suecos, que son como os finlandeses, pero con máis población, sí, un pouco todas estas razóns. E para min tamén era importante que estivera cerca dunha cidade grande, como de Copenhague, está como máis ou menos a 45 minutos, un pouco xa por preferencias persoais e tal, así que foi un pouco esta a decisión.
Pois me parece que é unha decisión extraordinaria dada a tua liña temática, efectivamente, Ana, moitísimas grazas. Non sei se hai algunha pregunta máis, pero se non hai, concluímos aquí dándoches grazas, Ana, por hoxe, e dicíndoche que efectivamente é extraordinario, pero se algún día queres retornar a Galicia, por favor, considere ECOBAS como como posible punto de arranque, que sería unha honra terte por aquí e darche as grazas de verdad pola tua presentación e pola tua visita hoxe. Así que, sen máis, entón, deixamos por hoxe, clausuramos a xornada de presentación tanto do doutorado como deste seminario. Moitas grazas e nos vemos o venres que ven con outro seminario máis, vai ser de pesquerías. Seguro que vamos a aprender moitísimo de como é a xestión pesqueira con relación á economía familiar en América Latina. Así que moitísimas grazas e ata semana que ven a todos os que nos siguen nos seminarios. Grazas, Ana, e grazas aos presentes.
María. Gracias a todos.